Hello, my name is Lieutenant Colonel Doug Gilbert, retired, and this is my story. It started way back when I was probably about 7 or 8 years old, actually. I had an uncle who was went off and fought in the Pacific, and then was wounded, came back to Pensacola for recuperation. After he got well, he decided that he'd go join the Army, go over to the occupation forces in Europe. And he did that, and after that was over with, he then decided, because the Korean War had broken out, that he would go to Korea with the Marine Corps. And he was with the 1st Marine Division, and he was at the Chosin Frozen Reservoir. The only thing that he ever commented to me about the war, nothing about Second World War, but about the Korean War, was he said he manned with the other crew members a quad 50 machine gun, which is basically 4 machine guns poked through steel plating and then firing. And the thing he said was the Chinese would come up this valley, and they were on top of a hill, and they would shoot down at them, and they'd stack them up like cordwood, where you could walk over the bodies without having to touch the ground. And that's the only thing he ever commented about. When he got home, this is the first recall that I have. And that was when a Trailways bus pulled up not far from my little house in Petersburg where I grew up. And I saw somebody in a uniform walking up the street, and it was him. And that kind of rang in my brain somewhere, I guess, and stayed there for a long, long time. After that, I grew up in Petersburg, a very small town. And in 1962, I believe it was, I was selected to be a page for Joel Evans in Congress. Now, they don't have pages anymore, but what that entails was you would go to I was in the House of Representatives. You would go to the House of Representatives every morning at 8:30, and you would take out all the old bills that had not been passed or had been tabled, whatever, and then you load in all the new ones for all 435 representatives. Now, there were several of us that worked that. We all lived in a page house, they called it, right across the street from the Supreme Court building. And when school started in August, because I was still there, I was up there for 6 months, from basically June to Christmas. When school started in August, I went to school in the Library of Congress. And I had to go to school at 4 o'clock in the morning, which means I was up by about 3 o'clock in the morning, getting dressed, going to school first, and then going to work over at the House of Representatives. And I did that until Christmas break, and then I came home. After graduating from high school, I went to Middle Tennessee State University. I went there, got a 4-year degree in political science, and also I was in ROTC. When I graduated, I went to Fort Bragg, where I was commissioned at Fort Bragg. Some of you that know Fort Bragg, you will remember Sand Hill, I'm sure. But I was commissioned there as a second lieutenant. After getting commissioned, I came home for a little while, and then I got orders to go down to Fort Polk, Louisiana, but the orders originally said proceed to Fort Polk for, I think it was 60 days, and then RVN, which meant the Republic of Vietnam. So I went to Fort Polk. I didn't exactly know what I was going to be doing down there. I was an infantry officer. I had gone through infantry officer basic and infantry officer advanced course prior to going to Fort Polk, in between getting commissioned in Fort Polk. Once I got to Fort Polk, I found out I was going to be a training officer and assigned to a company to train soldiers who were in the advanced infantry training, and I was assigned up to Tigerland, which was North Fort Polk. Tigerland was totally different from anything that I'd ever experienced before. It was quite harsh. The conditions were quite harsh. I got called up to brigade headquarters about 30 days after being there. They told me your orders are revoked and you're going to be made permanent party here at Fort Polk. And I thought to myself, well, that might be a blessing in disguise. I don't know. So I was made permanent party. I was still a training officer in a company. What we did was the trainees would graduate on a Saturday morning from an intensive, I think it was about 4 to 6 week course. And by 2 o'clock on Saturday afternoon, another busload of trainees would come in to start all over again. We ran these cycles almost for a whole year, and without hardly any of a break except for holidays. What did that involve? Well, it involved everything the trainee did, we had to do. If they went out in the field to fire rifles, we fired rifles. If they went out in the field to fire machine guns, we fired machine guns. If they went out in the field to fire anti-tank weapons, we fired anti-tank weapons. Pison Ridge was the training ground. It was about 8 to 10 miles from North Fort Polk Post and the company. At the end of the training sessions, what would happen would be we had to run or walk the 8 to 10 miles with full pack and gear. Full pack and gear would probably weigh anywhere from 50 to 60 pounds. So we had to do that with the trainees. And as a result, nowadays, I find out that kind of beats you up over a period of time. A couple of things that are highlighted I remember from being a training officer. One was that one day we were out on Payson Ridge, and it got to be nightfall, and we were down as staff members because committee group took over the training. And we were down drinking some coffee or having our meal or something. I can't remember what. And all of a sudden we look up and there's a trainee. I won't call his name, but he was walking down the mountain, dragging his M16 behind him, and he'd unslug it. Well, the company commander, and I won't say his name either, but company commander ran over to him and told him to get back up that hill. And he said he wasn't going back up that hill. He was too tired and he was hungry. And he said, well, what do y'all got to eat? And so the company commander told him again to get back up the hill, took the weapon from him, and said, if you don't get back up that hill, I'm going to shoot you. Now, the weapons had blank adapters on them, okay, but they are hot when the rounds go off. He said, I'm not going up that blankety-blank hill. So the company commander pushed the rifle right up to his stomach and let out about a 10-round burst. And it burned him a little bit through the clothes. And he yelled out, well, I'll be damned, you would shoot me too, wouldn't you? Well, we kept him down there. We called the MPs. They came and got him. We never saw him again. Another incident that I remember as a training officer was there was a trainee that disappeared when AWOL. We didn't know where he was, couldn't find him. Nobody knew where he was. He was gone like 3 days. And then finally, the mess sergeant went out to dump a bunch of garbage into a garbage container, one of those big ones that you put garbage into. And lo and behold, there he was. He'd been down inside of that the entire 3 days, eating the garbage that had been thrown down in there on him. Well, we called the MPs. They came and picked him up. We never saw him again either. So nobody really liked him very much. And one time we were out on Peace Run Ridge. It was cold. It was in the middle of the winter, and it had been raining up a storm. And so the trainees had been issued boots. So rubber boots to put on to keep wet, to keep from getting wet, stay dry. Excuse me. So lo and behold, the commanding general of the post came out to basically see how things were going with the trainees. He started talking to them, and they told him that, well, all our shoes are left-footed shoes. We don't have any right-footed shoes. Well, the company commander got called over to the woods, and everybody from 100 yards away could hear the general yelling at him. And within a few minutes, the company commander came back, got the general's Jeep, drove off. But before that happened, the general said, Lieutenant Gilbert, because I was the first lieutenant by then, you're in charge now. You're the company commander. He's relieved. So I became the company commander for a while. Right at the end of that tour at Fort Polk, I finally got out of Tigerland and went over to health services. They were trying to start health services in Leesville and the surrounding area because those were very poor counties, and they were wanting to provide, using military personnel, health services to the civilians. So I worked in coordinating, collaborating with the city council and the mayor and so forth, and trying to get that organized. I don't know what the fruition of that was, because I ETS'd, that means I got out prior to all that being implemented. But it was a relief from being up in Tigerland for sure. When I came back, I joined the Tennessee National Guard for a little while, and the unit that I was in was a missile unit. I didn't really know that at the time when I joined. I just joined because it was a close-by unit. The thing that I remember from that is we had to go down to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, and they had an Honest John missile, which was quite a large missile. I imagine it was 20, 30 feet long. Now, I didn't have anything to do with the preparation and firing of it, but I had to help with the trailer that pulled it down there and get it set up. And I remember we were told to get about 50 to 75, 100 yards away, and they cranked that missile up, and off it went. They fired it, and you could feel the heat blast from where we were standing. But now, the Camp Shelby's got big ranges, so I don't know how far down range it went, but that was the first time I've ever seen a missile fire. Never seen that before. I've seen a lot of weapons firing, machine gun night firing where tracer rounds are crossing each other, all this kind of stuff. Well, I decided that the Honest John Missile Battalion really wasn't right for me. I was an infantry officer. I wanted to get back to doing infantry things. So I found another guard unit up in Cookville, but this was a mechanized unit. In fact, it's still in existence today, the 278th Armored Cavalry. So I went up there, joined that unit as I believe at the time I was the executive officer. Things that I remember from being in that unit were we would go out and run these APCs, Armored Personnel Carriers. And we would run them, and they would crank them up. We'd make sure they were tuned up and everything. I wasn't part of the maintenance people, but I had to do the inspections. So we went to Fort Hood, Texas, and this time I was on long-term orders, and that meant I was on 179 days. So I went to Fort Hood, and we were practicing with those APCs at Fort Hood, and what I remember about that was I was one of the tank commanders, or one of the APC commanders. I was sitting up in the hatch, and we were rolling down the plains on this plateau doing probably 35, 40 miles an hour, about 5 of us. It was a platoon, I believe. And all of a sudden, we saw out in front of us, there was this huge cliff drop-off, probably 300 or 400 feet. So we immediately slammed on the brakes, turned the APCs around as fast as we could, and they kind of skidded up to the edge before we got them turned around. Then I guess it was I came back and I went into the IRR, which is the irregular reserve, the ones that are never called up unless it's just a national total emergency. But I realized I wasn't making any points toward retirement by being in the IRR, so I immediately called out to St. Louis Personnel Center, and I got to talking with a friend, or I got to talking and made friends, I should say, with one of the people that could authorize orders. So he authorized me. The first tour, I believe, was a week-long tour in Chattanooga, and it was a battlefield tour where we escorted general officers across Chickamauga battlefield. The only thing that I remember about that was there was a house, old log cabin in the middle of the battlefield, and the story goes there was a woman in the house who was actually I believe she was she was a rebel sympathizer, but the Union troops had occupied her house and around there, and she invited them all in for supper, and then she started feeding them wine and got a bunch of them drunk. So the next day, the first day of the Battle of Chickamauga, and a lot of those soldiers were drunk, and obviously they were not in the most excellent position to be fighting. After becoming friends with this guy in St. Louis, he put me on another 179-day tour, and in that tour, I went to Germany. And in Germany, I lived in what they called a concern, which is a small military post, not too far from Würzburg. We were attached to the 3rd ID, 3rd Infantry Division. And one of my jobs at that time became a briefing officer. You see, an infantry officer they'd say that they can do anything and everything. So I started doing anything and everything. So I became a briefing officer. And who I had to brief was the 3rd ID Division commander. I remember during that tour, I went out with a convoy one night, and they were running a convoy from Würzburg, maybe to Heidelberg. I don't remember exactly. But all of a sudden, a lot of these big, dark, black Mercedes started darting in and out of our trucks. And I turned over to the driver, and I said, "What's going on?" And he said, "Oh, those are the East Germans. They're going in behind every truck and writing down all the plate numbers and the number of what the unit is and everything." And I said, "Really? Well, shouldn't we stop them?" He said, "No, we let them go because we do the same thing to them over in East Germany." And I said, "Oh, okay." Well, anyway, while I was in Germany, I got to tour around a little bit, not a whole lot, but just a little bit. And later on, my wife and I went back to Germany and did all the sites that I had briefly seen, and that many more. Then the next thing was I came back, and he already had me lined up to go again on a mission to Egypt. And that was another 179-day tour. What I remember about that is several things. It was a long flight because we flew in one of those military aircraft, and we had web seating. We all lay down on the floor with our gear and everything. There must have been 15 or 20 people on board that flight. Now they weren't all going where I was going. They were going in to that area. We landed on an old Egyptian air base, as we come to find out the next morning. And it was probably about 10, 15 miles from Cairo. And when you looked out the front door of the building we were put in, first thing you saw was machine gun holes in the building. Second thing you saw was a whole bunch of, they were actually Russian jets that had been shot up by the Israelis. And they just left them laying there on the airfield. But somebody found out that I was a briefing officer, so they said, "Well, okay, you can go in to the ambassador's residence in Cairo, and you can help brief, or at least help design the briefs." By then, PowerPoint was the big thing. Help design the briefs that we're going to do to brief the generals that are here. It's all under Third Army. Third Army General was the commanding general of that. So I did that several times, and we found out that we could hijack rides in at night, because the way we got in the morning was the Arabs had cars. They were old Mercedes. They didn't have air conditioning or anything, but they were old Mercedes, and they would take us in the morning to the embassy. But at night, when they brought us back, we started talking to them and found out, well, can you take us in to see the pyramids? Because we hadn't been to see the pyramids. So 3 or 4 of us rode in several times. He took us to the pyramids at night, drove us all the way up to the top. We all gave him $20 bills. Well, he thought he was rich with that. So we asked him, then, well, you want to do it again? We said, yeah, we'll do it again. We said, well, what can we pay you with? And he said, well, you got some Budweiser or Marlboro cigarettes? We had a little PX wagon there, and so we went and bought him a couple of cartons of cigarettes and a couple of packs of Budweiser. You know, of course, this was an Arab. They're not supposed to drink or smoke or anything. But let me tell you, they drank and smoked like fire engines. So we gave him that, and we went in several times. He even took us to his house one time where his wife had fixed a meal for us. And we all went in, took our shoes off, and sat down on the rugs and passed the food around. And some of it you ate with your fingers. But it was interesting. It was a different culture altogether. The other thing that I remember about it was our tents. We stayed in Tent City. Our tents where we actually had our bed and lived was about 100 yards through the sand to the shower facility. So we would, every morning, of course, you wanted to shower, and every night you wanted to shower because it was so hot. I think the temperature there in the mornings or midday, it probably got up to about 120 degrees, but at night it'd fall down to about 75. Well, that's a 50-degree drop in temperature. You'd have to have a blanket on your bed at nighttime. But we'd go trekking through the sand, get a shower, and then no sooner had we got the shower and got it cleaned up, we had to trek back through the sand, and you had sand all over you again. And you were walking about the distance of a football field, back and forth. So then they asked me and said, well, you want to go over? Somebody said, well, you were an MP once. Well, I said, well, not really. I said, I was kind of anointed an MP. He said, no, we need some MPs out in the desert in the Sinai area. So I went with, I think it was 4 or 6 others to that area every day for at least a week to 10 days. The only thing that I remember about that was there was an Egyptian colonel, and he had, must have been 3 armored cars and Egyptian troops with him. And he wanted to go past a certain point that he wasn't supposed to go past because that was where the Israelis were. Well, our commander, and it wasn't me, got into a big argument with him and called the colonel, who came down there in a helicopter, and then they got in a big argument. Finally, the Egyptian turned around and went back. I don't know what happened after that, but I just remember that, they might have been shooting another war for all I know. So then, after that, I came home, and what happens next? I guess the next thing I did was I found a reserve slot in Nashville with the USAR school. See, I'd gone to CNGS as Command and General Staff College, and I graduated, and so then they hired me to be an instructor. So they saw that I'd done training, that I'd been a briefer and everything, so they hired me to be an instructor. And I did that for a couple of 3 years. Actually went down to Camp Shelby some to instruct troops down there, and we all lived in the old jock dormitories. Now, what I remember basically about that was that there were old jock dormitories, not the new ones, and the first few nights you either crank the temperature down to as far as it'll go, or what I did was after the first night when I found a cockroach on my nose, I went out and bought some of these air bombs, and I put them in the room, about 3 of them, and set them off, and I didn't go back to the room. I stayed in a hotel that night before I went back to the room because I had to stay on my own dime. Well, that seemed to kill the cockroaches out. but they were all in the walls. Everybody was complaining about it. It was not a really good place to be, to tell you the truth. But we would go in and we would teach the classes. Later on, I got a gig also down to Fort Benning to teach some classes as well in Command and General Staff College. After the instructor school, I went over and joined the 209th Military Police Brigade. Lo and behold, I became an MP as well. So the thing that I remember about doing that was we had trips down to Fort McClellan. And Fort McClellan at that time was the chemical post. And at that time, you went down there and you stayed in barracks. We found out later, right above where all the chemical munitions were. But we were going out into the woods because they built a mock POW camp. And the mission was to run that camp. They had trainees or permanent party people that had acted as prisoners. They had people that had acted as people that were riding, et cetera, et cetera. So that was an interesting assignment for a while. And after that, I joined something had been stood up in the Nashville area called the 125th ARCOM. That ARCOM stands for Army Reserve Command. Now they controlled all of Tennessee and parts of Kentucky and about 3,000 troops. Well, they found out that I'd done briefings and training, etc. So they said, well, you'll make a good public affairs officer. So, okay. So I went off to public affairs school, came back from that, and was a public affairs officer, actually until the ARCOM retired its colors and went away. Some of the things from that was we were actually activated during Gulf War I. I didn't go to the sandbox. I'd seen all the sand I wanted anyway. But we did go around. My wife and I went around and visited as many units that were being activated as possible. One of the things I remember was my wife and myself and another soldier had Thanksgiving dinner in Johnson City at a local hotel. We were away from home. We were on orders, and it was Thanksgiving, but we weren't close to family. I remember that part. Then after the ARCOM was deactivated, they stood up something called the 168th Support Group. Well, they found out that I had worked before in the National Guard with armored personnel carriers and everything. They assumed that I knew a lot about maintenance, which I did not. So I went over there and I did follow all the checklists and worked with them for a while. Then the commander called me back and said, well, we need you really as a public affairs officer. I said, well, I like that better. So I said, that'd be great. So I did that with them until they did away with the 168th. And by that time, it was basically time for me to hang up the sword and retire. So I did, and I went to work for a while with the VA on a contract that the VA pulled. And then I decided, well, I need something to do. So I went to work with the state legislature and worked for the Speaker of the House as a research analyst. Well, that lasted for quite a while until I got a phone call one day at home around Christmas time. And this phone call, because I'd put in a packet for reactivation if I could get it back on active duty. The phone call said, we've got your packet. We like what we see. If you're interested in coming to Fort Knox for 3 years, we'd like to interview you. So I discussed it with my wife, and I said, okay. So I went up and interviewed with them. They hired me, and they hired me as what was called an operations research analyst. And what that involved basically drawing up briefing slides again and doing briefings with the 3-star commander of the Sessions Command, which is now part of Recruiting Command. So I did that for 3 years, came back and forth home on the weekends because I missed home. I wanted to be home with my wife. She was teaching at the time and couldn't come. So I did that for 3 years. Now, the interesting part of that was they called me when I was age 60. And I went back on active duty, and they called me, right, like I said, right before Christmas. And they said, well, it's going to take us 3 months to get your paperwork processed. So by the time I got on active duty in March, I was almost 61. So I was probably the oldest person in that whole section because I was 61 years old. The good part of that was I didn't have to do PT, I didn't have to stand in formation, didn't have to do any of that. I'd get up early on Monday mornings, like 3:30 in the morning, and drive up there and be there by 8:30 their time. They were on Eastern time. Now, the good part also was, maybe that was a bad part, but the good part also was on Friday afternoon, they'd cut me loose about 4 o'clock, which was 3 o'clock, and I could be back in Nashville by about 4 o'clock. So, I guess after that, I came back and I got nominated. I don't know who put my name in, but I retired, and I got nominated for a United States Army Reserve ambassador. Now, what does an ambassador do? Well, they go out and they tell the Army Reserve story. They write up articles, they make pictures, anything that has to do with Army Reserve soldiers. And I became an ambassador for 3 years, and now I'm an ambassador emeritus and still doing the same thing. So I guess that's kind of the end of my story. I hope you enjoyed it.